and set the timer to turn the lights off and on, or the television off and on when you want it, you have fulfilled the word of the law. And you're not technically turning the lights on and off and lighting a fire. The timer's doing it. In Israel, in the high-rise hotels, they computerize and preset the buttons on what's called a Shabbat elevator to stop automatically at every other floor. You took it?
No, yeah, we took it up next.
Now, it takes forever to get where you want to go, but you can either, if you're lucky enough to be on a floor it automatically stops on, then you end up at your floor and you don't have to push the button. It's automatically pre-programmed. Or you may have to walk up or down a level. Well, I think that gives you a pretty good idea of what we're talking about here. And that's not to say that there's something wrong with the Orthodox for doing it that way. We all have to remember again that we have our own paradigms in our head about what's right and what's wrong and how things ought to work. You'll remember I did that little exercise where I said what comes after A, etc., and it was B all the way through G, and then you said H, and I said not if it's music, because A starts again. It depends on your game. And for the Orthodox, their game is the letter of the law. If you can find a way to get around the letter of the law, then you have every right to do it and do whatever you want. And that's not, those of us on the outside might say, well, that's hypocritical. Not if that's the way you see your legal work. Okay? Now, let's flip the page, and you should get to something with a paper clip that says Tract Shabbat, page 135, right? And at the bottom it says Mishnah. Now, if you look at this page, see under the Torah where it says the Mishnah? The Mishnah is codification and collection of Torah Sheba'al Peh, as handed down by word of mouth as opposed to having been written. Oral law, transmitted by word of mouth over generations, compiled by Rabbi Judah and his court somewhere between 160 and 200 CE in Palestine, which means in what is Israel today. Now, what happened is, as I said before, cases started coming up, and people would say, well, what constitutes work? Obviously, we know about fires, lighting fires, but what about other things? The rabbis come along, now the Torah history is gone, the Torah period is gone, there's a revolution in Judaism, the rabbis take over, they build on the laws, but they're really adding to it on their own. And they'll give you a law, and then they'll say, as it says in Torah, and they'll refer to a verse in Torah that may have the same word in it, even if it has nothing to do with it. Let's read what it says there under Mishnah. The principal acts of labor prohibited on the Sabbath are 40 less 1. That is not what the Torah says. Now we have 39 categories. Sowing, plowing, reaping, binding into sheaves, threshing, winnowing, fruit cleaning, grinding, sifting, kneading, baking, wool shearing, bleaching, combing, dyeing, spinning, warping, making 2 spindle trees, weaving 2 threads, separating 2 threads in a warp, tying a knot, untying a knot, sewing on with 2 stitches, tearing in order to sew together with 2 stitches, hunting deer, slaughtering the same, skinning them, salting them, preparing the hide, scraping the hair off, cutting it, writing 2 single letters, characters, erasing in order to write 2 letters, building, demolishing in order to rebuild, kindling, extinguishing fire, hammering, transferring from one place to another. These are principal acts of labor for the investment. Now, these were all needed, by the way, to build the tabernacle, the sanctuary, and the wilderness. Now, then suddenly somebody said, well, if you're not allowed to sow or plow, which is in the list, well, what does that mean exactly? And I got a case. And I know that my neighbor was doing such and such. I think he broke the law, and this is the penalty that he or she ought to pay. So they dragged him to court. Now, this is called the Gemara. If you look back at here, the evolution of law, look under Mishnah. You'll see where it says the Jerusalem Gemara and the Babylonian Gemara. Everyone see it? Okay. The Gemara are the court stenographic records of the arguments of Mishnah law in the rabbinic court. Everybody understand what I'm saying? Somebody wrote down the arguments on both sides, like a stenographer would take them down today in a court case. Now, sometimes these stenographic records would be incomplete in the sense that they would have what everybody says, but not what the decision is. So you still are left to your own imagination. In other cases, they would say, Rabbi so-and-so said this, Rabbi so-and-so said that, and the law goes with Rabbi so-and-so. So sometimes you're given guidance, sometimes not. One of the court, the Sanhedrin, one court met in what's Israel today, that's called Jerusalem. The other met in a huge Jewish community in Babylonia, which is Iraq and Iran today. And you therefore had two major Jewish areas where law was being developed. As a result, they all used the same basic Mishnah law, but their court cases came out with different stenographic records. So you end up today with two totally different sets of Talmuds. One is Palestinian, one is Babylonian. Ultimately, it was decided that the Babylonian Talmud would be the one by which law is set and that we would use. And there are 36 volumes of it. The Jerusalem Gemara is smaller. Now see the bracket on the left. If you put the Mishnah together with the Gemara, the basic Mishnah law, together right after it, as we're seeing here, the court cases that came right after the law, you have the what? The Talmud. So those people who wrote the Jerusalem Gemara based on the Mishnah, together by 700 CE create the Jerusalem Talmud, and those who do it in Babylonia create the Babylonian Talmud. And again, the Babylonian Talmud, often with the initials BT for Babylonian Talmud in English, it is the authoritative. Now let's go back and look at this Gemara based on the whole issue of working on Shabbat. For what purpose is the number so distinctly given? Said Rabbi Yochanan, if one labored through total ignorance of the laws governing the Sabbath, he has to bring a sin offering for every act of labor performed. Well, heck, those are expensive. If you had to keep bringing sacrifices for every area of the Sabbath law you broke. So it's very important that you know what really constitutes a category of labor, because you don't want to have to bring in more sacrificial animals than you can afford. Well, let's see what that means. Sowing, plowing. Let's see. Plowing, all being always done before sowing, let it be taught first. The Tana, the teacher, also known as the Mishnah, is a Palestinian, and in his country, they sow first, then plow. Someone taught that sowing, pruning, planting, transplanting, and grafting are all one and the same kind of labor. What would he inform us thereby? That if one performs many acts of labor, all of the same class, he's liable for one sin offering. Well, let's take the next one. Said Rabbi Achai in the name of Rabbi ben Ashi, quoting Rab Ami, one who prunes is guilty of planting. One who plants, transplants, or grafts is guilty of sowing. Of sowing and not of planting? Oh, I need to say of sowing also. So he's got to have two sin offerings. And it goes on. You wouldn't believe. Now, here's what happens in these Gemaras. while they're talking about, let's say, we don't have one here, they're talking about what the sins are and how many sin offerings you have to bring based on the category, somebody in the argument might bring up a case involving a woman. And it may be that she washed her hair on Shabbat and was that part of one of the categories. And then the court and the cases would run on for pages about women and washing their hair on Shabbat. All in the middle of the issue of plowing and sowing. So it was all over this stuff. And it finally is written down because the Jews from 200 to 700 CE were facing such discrimination and persecution, they believed that if they didn't write it down, it would be lost because all the Jews might be killed. So it all gets written down. And here's the amazing thing. There are rabbis in every generation who knew every one of these arguments in every volume of the Talmud, in all of the most incredible array of issues that came up. And without a computer, and there are rabbis still today who do that, if you go and say, what does this say? He would say, well, if you go to Talmud Yoma, which is about Yom Kippur, then it says this, and then if you go to this one, it says that, and that's all with a little computer, all up here. So you can imagine. And they purposely did it as long as they could, not writing it down, because if you were the only one who knew all the laws, you made the law, you then were very important, and you taught it to your son, then your son would be very powerful and important. And only later, once they wrote it down, did that then mean that all the people could have it. Now, back to the sheet. Here's the problem. A lot of people would then read these cases, and you see where it says comments and decisions of the Gaonim, 6th through 10th centuries, Rashi in France, the 11th century, a very famous commentator, Tosafot, commentary by descendants of Rashi. All three of those are major commentators who read this Talmud law and say, you know, it still isn't clear to me. And they write in the margin, they write what they think. I want to make sure, see if I write it down. They write what their interpretation of some aspect of that law was. And in their particular country in which they live, then their commentary or their interpretation of the law actually became what was used to determine how the people in that particular locale would live by. All that happening, though, the biggest problem is people didn't have computers. And you couldn't have your Rebbe around all the time to tell you what to do in each situation. And what was desperately needed was an encyclopedia by alphabet with all the laws from the Talmud grouped in the category that made the sense. If you wanted a section on what women were or were not allowed to do on Shabbat, then they had a need for all of those from all different volumes to be brought together in one spot. People wanted to know what to do. Jews wanted some guidance, but not every Jew was a Torah scholar. So, if you look there where it says Mishnah Torah by Maimonides, the Rambam, Egypt, 12th century, he was the first to come along with a code of Jewish law. And what he did is he went all through the Talmud, took everything that had to do with one category of law or issue, put it all together, made a table of contents, set it up either alphabetically or by the logical way you live your life. So if you were a woman and wanted to know what the law was with regard to washing your hair on Shabbat, you could go you would know what exact page to go to and read all the diverse scattered laws in one place. And those were called the law codes. The most famous of those, if you look underneath there, is called the Shulchan Aruch, which in English means the set table. In other words, it's all set for you. The idea is a table that's already got its tablecloth and its napkins and its plates. In their terms, though, what it meant was You don't have to go searching everywhere. It's all there for you. Now, if you will